All right, welcome to the second session. Today we're going to be covering the book Prince Caspian. And as I just said, we're going in the order of publication for the books. So last week we started the series off with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And this week, hopefully you were able to read, or maybe you'd be interested in reading Prince Caspian. This is, I think, Dr. Lindvall's least favorite of the seven, but he still does a great job. For those of you who didn't hear last week, the person who's giving these talks is Dr. Terry Lindvall, wonderful, sort of an expert on C.S. Lewis and also on communication theory. He's written books on satire and humor, very humorous guy himself. So I'm excited that he's going to be giving this video series over the next several weeks. And then at the end of that series, he's going to come in person so that if you have any questions that you are dying to ask him by the time you're done, he'll give a presentation on C.S. Lewis and laughter and satire, etc. And he'll be available for comments and questions. So this week, any questions before we begin about logistics or anything like that? There'll be time for questions at the end. This is, if it works, Prince Caspian.
Welcome to Narnia for Grown-Ups. This is our third session out of 8. And today we return to Narnia with our 4 Pevensie children that we last left them as they were kings and queens, and they were returning to the United States, or Britain, I'm sorry. Now, the unexpected call for everybody in your life, that's what gets us moving, that's what gives us direction. And the children have a call, a calling, or another word is vocation. Vocare means to call out. And so it's not just kind of a career they have or a job, but it's a real calling. And Simon and Garfunkel start us off with the first 2 lines of Homeward Bound. I'm sitting in a railway station, got a ticket to my destination. That's enough. They are sitting there in the station. Remember last week we talked about Edith Nesbit, and she created this portal to the other world through a railroad station. J.K. Rowling did the same thing. And so they are sitting there just quietly in the railway station, and there is a horn that's blown out in Narnia. Now, for Lewis, this is the mystery of all of our calling. Vocation comes again from the Latin vocare. And if we have a calling, that means there must be someone who calls us. It's not just to be called. When I was a child, my mother would have to go out and call me. And that calling, the someone, she was the someone who would call me in. Now, but this time, usually in the kind of fairy tales we have, we get a lamp and we rub the lamp and it's a genie that's called. And Lewis turns magical expectations around. He turns them upside down. He explores not how one might call a genie by rubbing a lamp, but let's say that you are the genie. He is saying, if you're the one being called, what's it going to be like? And so the children aren't kind of rubbing and finding a genie. They find out that they are the genies being called back to Narnia. So he's turned this all upside down. So what is it like to be a genie? Now we remember here, one little digression. We tell stories with our own voices. And one of my favorite comedians of all time was Robin Williams. He was in Aladdin, and he played the genie in Aladdin, as you remember, full of a lot of improvisation. He just could make things up. And he died several years ago. He was an old Episcopal, but in one of his last interviews, he talks about Narnia, and he said, my children gave me a great sense of wonder, just to see them develop into extraordinary human beings. And a favorite book for the children when they were growing up, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he said, I could read the whole C.S. Lewis series out loud to my kids. I was once reading to Zelda, and she said, Daddy, don't do any voices. Just read it as yourself. So I did. I just read it as myself, and she said, that's better. There's something about the language of Lewis that doesn't even need a Robin Williams. Now, Lewis was also fascinated by travel time. And I wanted to point this out just a little bit, too. H.G. Wells' The Time Machine was one of his favorite novels, even though he was an atheist. Now, he has kind of time that we've kind of created. Narnia is created in year 1 and it will be destroyed in 2555. But where that corresponds to what happens in British time is it begins in 1900, just 2 years after C.S. Lewis was born. Diggory and Polly, whom we'll meet in a couple weeks, kind of go back and they see the creation of Narnia. And then we go through World War I, where Lewis was, the Great Depression, World War II, and then finally in 1949, it's going to end in Britain too. So we have these two timelines going along and how you can enter one and then come back out. England time covers from 1900, Magician's Nephew, to 1949, and then a lifetime in Narnia consists of only seconds in Oxford. Of course, 40 minutes sitting here may feel like eternity, and not in heaven. Okay. When they return, one of the first things they do is they ask each other, "Do you remember?" The Vivenzi children repeat this question repeatedly. Do you remember? It is good and it is biblical to ask that question, to remember both good and bad times that we have lived through. If you remember the book of Joshua, they cross the Jordan, and the first thing they do is they get 12 stones to remember what God has done. Do we have those stones in our lives where we can remember the good and how God worked out of bad times to create good? Many things we may not know the mystery of yet, but we have to remember because God has called us to remember. And even what do we do with the Eucharist? We remember the Lord. So the past for Lewis is alive in the present. And that is for us as well. And that's why we need friends that we have known for a while, because we have shared experiences. Ben and I go back to 1967. We go back that far as friends, and so we can remember the same girls we dated on the same day. I didn't know it, but he did, until much later. But we keep asking, do you remember? Okay. And they come back, and as they come back to Narnia, Lucy is saying, imagine walls and columns there. And the older children don't have the ability to remember all of that. And remember a glass roof. And they look at this place that looks like a wilderness they've come into. They don't recognize it at all. And then they remember it's the castle where they were kings and queens. They have come back to Narnia and Cair Paravel. Now, if you go to New Zealand, you can see the place where they actually kind of shot this. Up in here, this area of the set for creating the Cair Paravel for the movie. And it's just really an amazing place. Okay? So the four children get into the castle. They go into the dungeon and they find the gifts that Aslan had given, or Father Christmas had given them in the last story. Peter finds his sword, Rindon. Susan finds her bow and arrows. The horn is somewhere else. And Lucy finds her medicinal cordial of flowers of the sun, in which she could give you a drop and you would be healed. I wish we could pull that back and have that one cordial to give and drink with one another. But Lewis is calling us to remember our past, to remember the gifts of life that we've been given in our past, and to continue to share them with others. One of the worst things that we do is not tell our grandchildren our stories. We don't tell them when we had our first broken bone. We don't tell them when we laughed and we couldn't control ourselves. Grandparents must tell their stories so the children can remember. And if they don't sit long enough for you to tell them, you get shackles and fetters and you put them in stocks and they'll have nowhere to go and you can spend all your time telling the story. Or also write them down. You can still write your stories, the one stories you want them to know, you begin writing. I have a habit, my granddaughter now is 14 months old, and every month I write something about her and me. And so by the time that I'm no longer there, she will have a book of remembrance. Do you remember? And it's never too late to start writing those stories. They find the old thrones that they occupied, and all of these ruins. In fact, most of our lives are ruins by this time. We can look back at the ruins and really appreciate it. We need to remember like archaeologists. We go back, we go, wow, I'm amazing. Look at me back then. And that's what Lewis is bringing, all of these archetypes for our memory. He brings in apples, armor, healing ointment, and swords to quicken our memory of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Scriptures. So the key thing he is doing in this book is he is showing how the past continues to be in our present, how what Jesus did on a cross and at the tomb still affects our lives today. However, the bad news. What the children also discover is they've come into a post-Aslan world. It's a post-Christian world. Our world does not know Jesus Christ anymore. I have students who cannot name a single gospel. This is at a Wesleyan university. I have students that don't know who John Wesley is or Charles Wesley. There is this vast ignorance of what the Christian faith is, even among some of our faculty, sadly, and administrators. So they come to this post-Christian world, this post-Aslan world, and they wonder what they're doing. Now, Edmund, who has read Robinson Crusoe, and this is the advice you give to children, read these great books. He remembers that when you're shipwrecked, the first thing you need to do is look for fresh water. Even in the Hunger Games, Jennifer Lawrence and their friends realized they need to find water. And water is one of the most essential things. But looking for water, they stumble upon an unexpected guest, the dwarf Trumpkin. And this leads to, after our initiation into Narnia, this long backstory about Prince Caspian. And this is a story that Lewis takes from basically Arthur and the Round Table. This is a medieval chivalry story. Remember last week it was a fairy tale like Elizabeth Nesbit would say. Now we're going into medieval chivalry. So the backstory is about Prince Caspian, who lives with his uncle, who has killed Caspian's father, but Caspian doesn't know it. He is also, according to Lewis, basically an Oliver Cromwell type character. He has usurped the throne, and he sends out 7 nobles that were loyal to Prince Caspian's father to go to the islands. And that's coming up next week. That's a much better adventure. But usurper, Lord Miraz, has shadows of a Shakespearean play, Hamlet. You remember, Hamlet's father was killed by his uncle Claudius. Claudius has usurped the throne, and so Lewis has taken that plot and just put it into Narnia. But there's also the Disney movie, Lion King, which is also based on Hamlet and also on Prince Caspian. He has a red-haired wife whose name is Pruna Prismia. And Charles Dickens has a character in Little Dorrit who always speaks in alliterations. Prunes and prisms, she says, prunes and prisms. This will become a habit with the dwarf Trumpkin. Oscar Wilde, also in The Importance of Being Earnest, introduces the governess Mrs. Prism and Mrs. Prizzle. So Lewis is giving us a lot of little tidbits for anyone that's read literature to say, delight in this, I'm giving you some candy, some mind candy to kind of play with as you go through the story. But regarding prunes, Lewis had a certain distaste that gave him an affinity with children. Once he was in a hotel room, and Lewis said rather too loudly, "I loathe prunes." "So do I," came an unexpected 6-year-old voice from another table. He said, sympathy was instantaneous. Neither of us thought it funny. We both knew that prunes are far too nasty to be funny. Now, Lewis also takes a swipe at Caspian's modern education at the time, too, and he satirizes school books of pedantic scholars like Ben Fraser and myself. They write books like The Grammatical Garden or The Arbor of Accidental Pleasantries Open to Tender Wits by Pulverlentus Siccus. Pulver means to kind of put into dust. Lentus means slow. Siccus means dry. So the book is dusty, dry, and slow reading. It's one of the worst things you could have done. And if you haven't bought Ben's book, it's very much like this. So, however, in contrast to that teacher, he has Dr. Cornelius, who teaches the old stories. He is the tutor, and he's also somewhat of an Irish nurse that is there. And he would rather not cut down jungles. He wants to irrigate the imagination of C.S. Lewis, of Prince Caspian. And so he tells him the stories of Narnia. But when King Miraz has a son of his own, Caspian becomes an obstacle that must be eliminated. He escapes to meet with the real Narnia, and he finds Susan's horn, and he blows it, and that's what brings Susan and her siblings into Narnia. Now, we talked about Michael Ward, who found the planetary influence in each of the books. Who remembers what the planet was for the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Which planet was it? Jupiter. Very good, Jupiter. Now we're going to find Mars. Here is the god of war, and we're going to have the great war of deliverance. Now, the Kappa element is the cryptic part, the riddle that Lewis puts in his things. And Michael Ward found two traces of Mars. Mars is known for his battles and his wars, and secondly, for his trees. Before he became the god of war, he was the god of sylvanism, like Pennsylvania, Penn's forest. He was the god of trees. The word martial only appears in this book and none of the other Narnian books. So we get this. Now, in Mere Christianity, Lewis speaks of enemy-occupied territory, and that's what we've come into. And he recalls his experiences when he was in World War I. He was a young atheist in November 1917 when he joined the British Army as a second lieutenant in the Somerset Light Infantry. On the front lines in the Somme Valley in France, he would get trench fever, he would be wounded by shrapnel that exploded right in his ditch, but he would also have a company of about 30 Kaiser's soldiers come with their hands up and surrender to him. He didn't expect it, but they came, and he was a great lieutenant. But after 5 months in the trenches, he had had enough of war. The fright, the cold, the smell of high explosive, the horribly smashed men still moving around like half-crushed beetles. He gave lectures in World War II to RAF pilots, and he said why I am not a pacifist, because he had seen the difference between light and darkness. He had seen what happened if you let darkness try to overcome the innocent people. And so in Narnia, we have this great battle that's occurring again. Allusions to Mars are numerous. The first memories of Narnia for the children are of battles. The first discovery in the castle is a golden knight chess piece. The first lesson that Caspian has is sword fighting. The first treasure found in the chamber is armor. And you think of spiritual armor from the book of Ephesians. Caspian's ancestor is Caspian the Conqueror. Lucy remembers the War of the Roses. Courage and valor are the key virtues. And so Michael Ward isn't just making these things up. You begin to see the evidence of how Mars really controls all of this book. So a lot of kind of chivalry duels and battle actions that we find going on here. The book is also populated with a cast of soldiers, captains, sentries, and scouts. Weapons abound: mail shirts, helmets, daggers, bows, arrows, shields, and swords. So all of these things have that kind of flavor. Medieval chivalry invites single combat between Miraz and Peter. Now, when the Council of War is held, Glenstone the Centaur speaks, "My son and I are ready for war. When is the battle to be joined?" So I think you get the point that this is a Mars book that is there. Now the sylvan aspect, the trees aspect also come too, because the children wander from the castle and they begin to move to try to find the rest of the Narnians. The dryads, the spirit of trees, come to life, but they can only come to life as Aslan calls them. Now, trees and forests are all over. That's why Lewis puts these tree spirits into Prince Caspian, and they never appear in another Narnian book. Mars was the god of March as well, when the trees come back to life after winter. But only Aslan can wake the trees, and he gives a great war cry, summoning everyone to the final battle. So he wakes the trees, and the trees are whispering, but they won't, nobody else can wake them up. But when they wake up, it's almost a beautiful sight. And this is one thing I think this horrible movie on Prince Caspian captured. They captured the idea that you can bring this tree to life, and you can see that God created trees as our fellow creatures. Now, they're going on their trek. They're moving along. They want to join them. And that leads us to three themes in this book: fear, faith, and festivity. First, he teaches children about the nature of fear. He teaches that he had certain fears himself. He was afraid of insects, ghosts, and cliffs. He had vertigo. He could stand up here and he could not look out the window. He would become so dizzy. The rest of us just kind of marvel at what's going on, but he would get dizzy. But he said, as a child, I was traumatized by a pop-up book. And you may remember those books that you open up, and one had a spider that jumped out with all of its pincers. And he said, after that, I was so afraid of spiders the rest of my life. But he said there are good fears and bad fears. A fear of public speaking was not one of his phobias. However, one of my early fears was a woman. And she married me. It's really scary. Okay, never go on. Okay, I'm going to skip on there. So King Miraz and his army of Telmarines are afraid of the sea and the forest of trees. Even though they don't believe in the talking trees, they're afraid of them. They don't want to go to the woods. And these are superstitious fears, but one remembers the prophecy in Macbeth. Remember the walking trees of Birnam Wood. They get up and they move towards Macbeth. That is kind of the right to fear the woods. Now, I asked students who hadn't finished their papers, who would they rather meet in the hall? Would they rather meet their professor or a demon from hell? 90% said the devil. The other 10% said they couldn't tell the difference, okay? I'm just as bad as any devil there, okay. Fear can be determined by our preconditions. The Telmarines, fearful of the black woods, leads to their hatred of nature. And what one fears, one comes to dislike. They imagine the woods and the rivers to be filled with ghosts, and they even make a fuss about wading a river, afraid of running water, because they know something is going to come from across the sea. And they're terrified thoroughly at the sight of Aslan. Because they knew about lions, they had not believed in them, and this made their fear greater. Their cheeks become the color of cold gravy, their knees knocked, and many fell on their faces. Lewis echoes Ezekiel 7:17, which nobody ever preaches on, where he says, every hand will go limp and every leg will be wet. He's talking about urine. Next time you go to a Presbyterian church, ask for them to preach on Ezekiel 7. Okay. Now, when the evil dwarf Nickabrick mentions the name of the White Witch to Caspian, Cornelius, and Truffle Hunter, they shudder. He says, don't be afraid of a name as if you were children, but the name of the White Witch is one that should strike caution. When you talk about the devil, when you talk about Satan, you should be aware. And Lewis implies that a healthy fear of evil is good, because the devil prowls about like a lion, seeking to devour us. Yet one is called to overcome these fears. As in Rolling's He Who Should Not Be Named, you still respect it. In contrast, when Aslan returns, he counsels Susan not to listen to her fears. If she does, her faith cannot come to the front. But Susan listens to false fears, and I think that is the danger of all of us as well. There are things we are afraid of, and we let them dwell in our imagination. And Aslan comes to breathe in us and take away those fears. It is not going to be as bad, and we become anxious instead of really trusting God. And Aslan says, if you have fear, let me breathe on you. Let His Holy Spirit come into you. Lewis almost speaks to the heart as well as the head. And the way to deal with our fears, he says, is to receive faith. At the end, one of my favorite little moments is there's a child at the old woman's college who was not afraid of Aslan because she had never seen a picture of an ordinary lion. And so when Aslan arrives as wild as lightning, she receives him because he is also as tame and as gentle as a kitten. He comes as we need him. That was fear. There's a return to faith. Unfortunately, people in Narnia have lost their faith and a sense of tradition. The old stories are no longer told. The old beliefs have been given way to a progressive and culturally popular one. There are fewer people today that know about Moses or Paul than they do about Taylor Swift. And so we begin to realize the old stories are not told. But I will tell you, in 20 years, there'll still be more people who know Moses than Taylor Swift. She too will pass into oblivion. One kind of faith is denial. And Miraz and modern men just do not believe. They call them old wives' fables about Peter and Esmond. But Glozell says, I believe my eyes, Your Majesty. There is evidence that something is there. But when Mraz blots out the evidence, he goes blindly into battle and ultimate defeat. There is also disbelief in the good. Nickabrick, disbelief leads not to atheism or materialism, but to the occult. And people, when they don't believe in good God, they will go anywhere to find something that is spiritual. And Nickabrick says, it's better or anything, I'll believe in anything or anyone that get rid of my other enemy. Anything, Aslan or the White Witch, I don't care which. During his gospel period, Bob Dylan wrote, everyone's got to serve somebody and have a belief in something. John Lennon cynically rejoined was, serve yourself, believe in yourself. But we find that those who believe in themselves have a false God, and there's no comfort in that. And so Nickabrick's pragmatism leads him to collaborate with the hags and the ogres and others. If one does not believe in God, Lewis writes, one can believe in anything, and it leads to death. But then there's the holy doubt of Trumpkin, like that of the disciple St. Thomas. He doesn't believe, but he's just a little bit skeptical, and so he needs to be persuaded. Frederick Buechner calls doubt the ants in the pants of faith. And we need a little doubt in our lives, and doubt comes into our lives. We wonder, how long, O Lord, are you going to not come and rescue us? Lord, the wicked seem to prosper and we don't. And so those doubts are allowed, and God wants us to come to him with his doubts. But this third example contrasts the skeptical doubt of Trumpkin, the red dwarf, and the settled, solid, sensible faith of Truffle Hunter the badger. You all need to know a badger. We need to know the badger. We need to know the people whose faith is solid. However, Trumpkin will not believe without being shown. He doesn't believe in walking trees or the horn, even the children. He can hardly believe it, he says. But when he begins shot by Susan, he's healed by Lucy, he believes the children are there. And Trumpkin reflects Lewis's own sense of healthy skepticism. It takes Trumpkin's encounter with the objective reality of Aslan to convince this doubting Thomas to believe. The whole story of Trumpkin's really kind of fun. It's very much like Lewis's own conversion. Lewis said, I came into the kingdom kicking and screaming, trying to find some way out. I didn't want to believe. He said, I was a very reluctant and stubborn convert. He says, I looked for a way to get out. But God came, Jesus came and just took him up and made him realize that what the stories about him were true. And so Trumpkin, when he first meets Aslan, doesn't know what to do. But Aslan takes him and throws him in the air like he's playing with a kitten. And it's just a wonderful way that Aslan comes into his life. He also learns alliterative expletives. Thimbles and thunderstorms. Okay, everybody say these. Thimbles and thunderstorms. Okay, say it 3 times real fast. Thimbles and thunderstorms. Okay. Giants and junipers. Okay, good. Now at dinner tonight, I want you to make your own alliterative expletive. Okay, when you get upset with yourself. Okay, Terry goes toads and toes. Ben goes brambles and bunions. Okay, think of something when you get angry. You just use alliteration about your first name, and it'll be much better. Okay, meatballs and marshmallows. Martha. Good. There you go. Okay. Peter Dinklage, who is the star of Game of Thrones, plays Trumpkin, and he does a really good job, I think. And they move along, and Truffle Hunter asks him, what are the kings and queens like? Trumpkin says, malcontents, complainers, stubborn as mules in the morning. Nickabrick says, so you like them then? Well, enough. Those are the kind of people we like. We get used to them, the complainers and everyone else. And so they're there. Now, the children have their own battle of faith and try to find their way on their way. Lucy's the first one to see Aslan, but none of the others do. But Lucy doesn't act on her faith. Her faith, believing, is finally made sight. And that for all of us, many times we will not see the evidence for what we need, but by believing we'll come to see it. And her mystical faith and her intimate knowledge of knowing Aslan allows her to see him. She excused herself, well, I couldn't leave the others, could I? And don't look at me like that, she says. Oh, well, I suppose I could. She asks if the others will see him, and he responds, certainly not at first, but later on depends. And even if they don't believe her, she is to follow him down a cliff at the edge of the gorge and through the tough times. And you remember last week I talked about Curdie and the princess was given that thread. And she followed the thread to the pile of rocks, and she found out that she was called there to rescue Curdie. And so it is in our lives. We're called to be with somebody that we don't want to be with, but God wants us there because He has given us a thread to rescue somebody else. She says to Aslan, "Oh, I wish I were braver." He says, "If you were any braver, my dear, you'd be a lioness." And she observes that Aslan looks bigger. He says, "That's because you are older, dear one, little one." Her mystical faith becomes greater. Chesterton says the paradox of how things of the past look smaller. Have you ever gone back to your old home? Or tried your old wedding dress? Okay. You find that things are sometimes smaller than you remember. Okay? This is what God is here. He's saying, it's not so much that I have grown, that you've gotten smaller, but I have gotten bigger to you. You see more of me. And the more we see of God, the greater He becomes. Believing is seeing. The full conversion of Edmund occurs because he betrayed his sister last time, but now he says, last time I didn't believe Lucy, I ended up looking pretty stupid. So this time I'll follow him. Creation awakes, and I'm just going to run through this quickly. This is Avalon. I don't know, any of you ever been over to Avalon in Ireland? It's where you walk in the treetops. And from what I've heard, they've established one down here at the museum.
Vintage apartment. Granddaughter works there.
Oh, really? Have you been up there yet?
Yes.
Yes. So it's just wonderful to walk among the trees. So here's where the trees all come to life. And they're all kinds of trees. They're birch girls, willow women, proud pines, queenly beeches, shaggy old oaks. Henry, kind of a shaggy old oak. Bright maples, clinging vines, prickly cacti. Okay? So here are all the trees. Look at yourself as a tree. What kind of tree are you? Dogwood, okay. What other kinds of trees? Maple. I love maples. River birch. I'm a little bonsai. Japanese, tiny little. No, I'm not. Okay, we'll move on. So the roar of Aslan begins the liberation of this. And Romans talks about here. His roar wakens the trees. The wood, the end of the world. Mars, war, and wood join together as the trees plunge through the ranks of Peter's army to chase the Telmarines. Aslan is the god over nature, over trees, over wheat, over wine and oil, and he wakes up all creation at the end. Creation, remember, is groaning. It's groaning to be made complete again. It's been affected by our fall. Now it's going to be wilder and more wonderful than Mardi Gras and Carnival at the end of the book. Miracles begin to happen. Streams begin to run with wine, not water. The forest burst alive with jollification. Say jollification. Jollification. Okay, now look at the person next to you and say, jollify me. Okay, I want you to jollify people later on today that's going on. But everything, Salinas is back, and everything. Mythologist Edith Hamilton recognized the wildness and danger of a Bacchanalian frenzy. No other festival could compare with the Greek festival of Bacchus. It took place in spring when the vine put forth its branches and fruit lasting for 5 days. Ordinary businesses stopped. No one went to prison, and prisoners were released to party. Salinas, drunken old and enormously fat, the attendant of Bacchus, rides a donkey, and he continually falls off calling for refreshments, grapevine and fruit. Maenads, the female members of Bacchus's company, leap and rush, turn somersaults, and dance the dance of abundance, shouting Bacchus's surname, one, woi, which is joy. And so they're all partying at the end. And we see the miracle of water changed into wine from John 2:9. And at the end, what's really interesting is that we find that Dionysius is there, and he's a youth, and he's dressed only in a fawn skin. He's made very tame here, but he has a wild face, almost too pretty for a boy. Edmund thinks like he could be capable of doing anything. The two girls discuss his rowdiness, and Susan, the elder girl, says, I wouldn't have felt very safe with Bacchus and his wild girls without Aslan. No, responded Lucy, I should think not. In Bruno Betterheim's Use of Enchantment, he says fairy tales help children mature. And Susan is at 13 years old. She stands at the liminal state of becoming a young woman. And so she knows that things are beginning to percolate in her. and she knows it's not going to be safe to be around this one little boy. Okay. So we've seen the planet Mars connected to war and to woods. He awakens the river. All of creation that has grown is now coming to life in ways that is just so wonderful and amazing. And he comes, and again, the water just destroys all of them. The river god gets rid of the shackles on itself, which is a bridge, and everything is free that was enslaved, confined, or repressed. It almost seemed like a game, Lewis wrote, like tag, or blind man's buff, or hide the slipper. But everyone was it, and everyone was blindfolded. Aslan liberates the river from its chaining bridge, dogs from their chains, poor Gwendolyn from a progressive school, another harassed school teacher whose boys end up looking like pigs. She is so happy to escape her classroom. And so here's the final effect of liberation. We gradually become what we are, and the snooty boys in Narnia become little pigs. Aslan just kind of hurries the place up. And those are 3 of my students today. Okay. When he heals an old woman, she turns out to be Caspian's nurse from the beginning of the book. And she says, "Why, I do declare I feel a little better. I think I could take a little breakfast this morning." In the gospel, you remember, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, and immediately she gets up and begins to make dinner. Now that's a healing. Breakfast right after a healing. And so we end with food. When they first come, they've only brought their lunches, but now they find apples, and apples are always a good sign. When they rescue the dwarf Trumpkin, he catches some rainbow pavender fish. When Cornelius helps Caspian escape, he loads him down with some remains of cold chicken, slices of venison, bread, an apple, and a little flask of wine. I'm again trying to whet your appetite for what follows this meeting. Okay, little by little, hopefully you're becoming hungrier and hungrier. Even before a war council, the always hungry bulgy bears want supper. They're always seeking honey, like Winnie the Pooh, or sucking their paws. And when Narnia is finally liberated, everyone shouts, "Refreshments, refreshments," and everyone begins eating and drinking. Really good grapes, firm and tight on the outside, but bursting into cool sweetness when you put them in your mouth. One little boy who had been crying a moment before bursts out laughing when Aslan breaks the chains of the dogs. He also says, "I declare I'm better. I think I could take a little more breakfast this morning." And at the last dance of the liberation, a feast comes into existence. Now, to get your menu for tonight. There are sides of roasted meat that fill the grove with delicious smells. There are wheat cakes and oat cakes, honey and many-colored sugars and cream as thick as porridge and as smooth as still water, peaches, nectarines, pomegranates, pears, grapes, strawberries, raspberries, pyramids and cataracts of fruit. And then in great wooden cups and bowls, wreathed with ivy, came the wines, dark, thick ones like syrup of mulberry juice, and clear red ones like red jellies liquefied, and yellow wines and yellowy green and greenish yellow. Lewis gets really carried away because he describes a dessert of chocolate loam for the tree people. He says they're going to eat dirt that is so sweet and wonderful. And so the last thing is here at the end. Aslan has liberated all of Narnia. Mars has come down and freed the people. Aslan welcomes Caspian, and he asks him if he feels himself sufficient to take up the kingship of Narnia. And Caspian says, I don't think I do, sir. I'm only a kid. Good, said Aslan. If you had felt yourself sufficient, it would have been proof that you were not. And for all of us, are we good enough to enter the kingdom of God? Well, sir, I don't think so. Good, come on in. He welcomes us and he says, refreshments, refreshments for all. Thank you. Next week, we go to a much better book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And hopefully we'll have some maps for you so you can kind of follow where we're going on this little journey. Thank you again. Thank you.
All right. So time for a few questions or comments? I know it's quite a lot to take in. How many, just out of curiosity, how many have been interested enough to open up one of these books? Okay, good. Yeah, they really are wonderful, and feel free, like I said, to take. I'm going to leave some up here if you'd like to grab one just to take. Next week we'll do Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and I do hope that you get the sense of just the richness of them. How much is in? He's mentioning quite a bit, and you can sort of see the depth of it, but he's just really scratching the surface. There's a lot there. So hopefully, as you read it with the sort of the joy and levity of a child, but also with more mature adult eyes, you'll be able to see some of these allusions and deeper themes. Anything else? All right. Have a wonderful week. Next week, Voyage of the Dawn Treader.